Early history. Vietnam gained formal independence in 1945, but it took another 3 decades of fighting before the Republic of Vietnam was formed. Indochina comprises the modern countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These countries were always under the shadow of the powerful empire of China. Even after independence, northern and central Vietnam continued to maintain the Chinese system of government as well as Chinese culture. Despite being a close neighbor to India and suffering from colonizers, nationalism developed in Vietnam differently. The French controlled military and economy of Vietnam. They also built a system that tried to reshape the culture of the Vietnamese. Nationalism in Vietnam emerged to fight against the French and all they represented. French consolidated their position and people in Vietnam began reflecting on the nature of the loss that Vietnam was suffering. Nationalist resistance developed out of this reflection. Why the French thought colonies necessary? Why colonize? For supply of natural resources and essential goods. Being advanced, wanted to bring civilization to backward people. The French used forced labor to increase rice production and allowed the export of rice to the international market. Vietnam exported two-thirds of its rice production and by 1931 had become the third largest exporter of rice in the world. Use of forced labor are of 3 types. They are drain Mekong Delta, build irrigation canals, increase cultivation. Trans-Indochina rail network that linked the northern and southern parts of Vietnam and Yunnan in China. The second line was also built, linking Vietnam to Siam, as Thailand was then called, via the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh. Some infrastructure projects developed by the French. To ensure higher levels of profit for the businesses, French business interests pressurized the government in Vietnam to develop the infrastructure. This helped in transport of goods for trade, moving military garrisons, and controlling the entire region. Colonies had to serve the interests of the mother country. Paul Bernard believed that the economy of the colonies needed to be developed so that the standard of living of the people improved. They would buy more goods. The market would consequently expand, leading to better profits for French business. Bernard suggested that there were several barriers to economic growth in Vietnam. Barriers to economic growth are also of three types. They are extensive indebtedness amongst the peasants, high population levels, low agricultural productivity. The colonial economy in Vietnam was based on rice cultivation and rubber plantations. These were owned by French and few Vietnamese elite. Indentured Vietnamese labor was used in the rubber plantations. The French not industrialized the economy. In the rural areas, landlordism spread and the standard of living declined. Rail and port facilities were set up to service this sector. French were also on civilizing mission like British in India. They believed that Europe had most advanced civilization, so it was their duty to introduce modern ideas to the colony, even if this meant destroying local cultures, religions, and traditions, because these were seen as outdated and prevented modern development. Once educated, the Vietnamese may begin to question colonial domination. French citizens living in Vietnam, called colons, began fearing that they might lose their jobs as teachers, shopkeepers, policemen to the educated Vietnamese. Chinese, the language used by the elite so far, had to be replaced. But what was to take its place? Vietnamese or French? Education was a tool to civilize the native. The French needed educated local labor force, but they also feared that education might create problems. It was suggested that Vietnamese be taught in lower classes and French in the higher classes. The few who learned French and acquired French culture were to be rewarded with French citizenship. Only Vietnamese elite enrolled in the schools, and only a few could pass the school leaving examination because of a deliberate policy of failing students in the final year so that they could not qualify for the better paid jobs. In 1925, in a population of 17 million, there were less than 400 who passed the examination. School textbooks glorified the French and justified colonial rule. The Vietnamese were represented as primitive and backward. School children were told that only French rule could ensure peace in Vietnam. Western-style education included classes in science, hygiene, and French. These classes were held in the evening and had to be paid for separately. It was not enough to learn science and Western ideas. To be modern, the Vietnamese had to also look modern. The school encouraged the adoption of Western styles, such as having a short haircut. For the Vietnamese, this meant a major break with their own identity since they traditionally kept long hair. Resistance in schools. As the numbers of Vietnamese teachers increased, it became difficult to control what was taught. While teaching, Vietnamese teachers quietly modified the text and criticized what was stated. In 1926, a major protest erupted in the Saigon Native Girls' School. Students fought against the colonial government's efforts to prevent the Vietnamese from qualifying for white-collar jobs. By the 1920s, students were forming various political parties, such as the Party of Young Annan, and publishing nationalist journals, such as the Annanese Student. Schools thus became an important place for political and cultural battles. The French sought to strengthen their rule in Vietnam through the control of education. They tried to change the values, norms, and perceptions of the people. The battle against French colonial education became part of the larger battle against colonialism and for independence. French rebuilt Hanoi with latest ideas about architecture and modern engineering skills. In 1903, the modern part of Hanoi was struck by bubonic plague. The French part of Hanoi was built as a modern and clean city with wide avenues and a well laid out sewer system. The large sewers in the modern part of the city became ideal breeding ground for rats. Though the sewer rats moved around the city and began to enter the well cared for homes through the sewage pipes. Rat hunt. Rat catchers took to just clipping the tails and releasing the rats, so that the process could be repeated over and over again. Some people began raising rats to earn a bounty. To stem plague, a rat hunt was started in 1902. Vietnamese workers were paid when a tail was given as proof that a rat had been killed. Vietnamese learned collective bargaining and negotiate a higher bounty. They also discovered innovative ways to profit from this situation. Defeated by the resistance of the weak, the French were forced to scrap the bounty program. Religion and anti-colony. The French occupied Vietnam, militarily supported spread of Christianity as it helped strengthening colonial control. It also provided ways of resistance. Vietnam's religious beliefs was a mixture of Buddhism, Confucianism, and local practices. French missionaries viewed tendency to revere the supernatural as something to be corrected. An early movement against French control and the spread of Christianity was the Scholars' Revolt in 1868. Officials at the imperial court revolted and led a general uprising in New An and Ha Tien provinces, where over 1,000 Catholics were killed. The French crushed the movement. This uprising inspired other patriots to rise against the French. Many popular religions in Vietnam were spread by religious leaders. Huy Phu So, founder of Hoa Hoa, inspired movement against French. The French tried to suppress Huy Phu So movement and declared him to be mad bonds and put him in a mental asylum. In 1941, French doctors declared that he was sane and exiled him to Laos. Such religious movements aroused anti-imperialist feeling but had a contradictory relationship with mainstream nationalism. Political parties needed their support but were uneasy about their activities. They could neither control or discipline these groups nor support their rituals and practices. Some Vietnamese intellectuals felt that Vietnamese traditions had to be strengthened to resist the domination of the West, while others felt that Vietnam had to learn from the West even while opposing foreign domination. In the late 19th century, resistance to French domination was very often led by Confucian scholar activists. Phan Boi Chau, 1867 to 1940, was one such nationalist. Phan Boi Chau formed the revolutionary society Dui Tang Hoi in 1903 with Prince Quang De as the head. Phan Boi Chau met the Chinese reformer Liang Qichao, 1873 to 1929. The history of the loss of Vietnam was written under the strong influence and advice of Qichao. Phan Chu Trinh, 1871 to 1926, differed with ideas Phan Boi Chau. He was intensely hostile to the monarchy and opposed to the idea of resisting the French with the help of the court. He wanted to establish a democratic republic. He did not want a wholesale rejection of Western civilization. He demanded that the French set up legal and educational institutions and develop agriculture and industries. Inspiration from Japan and China. Go East movement had following three purposes. They were place for refuge for those who were escaping French police. They were models for change. They were location for Asian network of revolutionaries. Early Vietnamese nationalists had a close relationship with Japan and China. In 1907-1908, some 300 Vietnamese students went to Japan to acquire modern education and to get help in driving out the French from Vietnam, overthrow the puppet emperor, and establish the Nguyen dynasty that had been deposed by the French. Japan was a model as it had modernized itself and had resisted colonization by the West. Its victory over Russia in 1907 proved its military capabilities. Vietnamese students established a branch of the Restoration Society in Tokyo, but after 1908, the Japanese Ministry of Interior clamped down on them. China was a model as it had overthrown monarchy by a popular movement led by Sun Yat-sen, and a republic was set up in 1911. Inspired by these developments, Vietnamese students organized the Association for the Restoration of Vietnam, Vietnam Quan Phuc Hoi. The anti-French independence movement now wanted to set up a democratic republic. Due to the Great Depression of the 1930s, prices of rubber and rice fell in Vietnam, leading to rising rural deaths, unemployment, and rural uprisings in electrical fuses provinces, Nha An and Ha Tinh. The French put these uprisings down with great severity, even using planes to bomb demonstrators. In February 1930, Ho Chi Minh established the Vietnamese Communist Party, later renamed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1940, Japan occupied Vietnam, so nationalists now had to fight against the Japanese as well as the French. The League for the Independence of Vietnam, Vietnam Doc Lap Doc Minh, or Viet Minh, fought the Japanese occupation and recaptured Hanoi in September 1945. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was formed and Ho Chi Minh became chairman. The new republic faced a number of challenges. The French tried to regain control by using the Emperor Bao Dai as their puppet. Faced with a French offensive, the Viet Minh were forced to retreat to the hills. After 8 years of fighting, the French were defeated in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. The supreme French commander of the French army was taken prisoner. General Henry Navarre had declared confidently in 1953 that they would soon be victorious. But on 7th May 1954, the Viet Minh annihilated and captured more than 16,000 soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps. The entire commanding staff, including a general, 16 colonels, and 1,749 officers, were taken prisoner. In the peace negotiations in Geneva that followed the French defeat, the Vietnamese were persuaded to accept the division of the country. North and South were split. Ho Chi Minh and the Communists took power in the north, while Bao Dai's regime was put in power in the south. The Bao Dai regime was overthrown by Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem built a repressive and authoritarian government. Diem retained Ordinance 10, a French law that permitted Christianity but outlawed Buddhism. His dictatorial rule came to be opposed by a broad opposition united under the banner of the National Liberation Front, NLF. With the help of the Ho Chi Minh government in the north, the NLF fought for the unification of the country. US policy planners feared that the victory of the Ho Chi Minh government would start a domino effect. Communist governments would be established in other countries in the area. Worried about communists gaining power, it decided to send in troops and arms. US entry into the war proved costly for the Vietnamese as well as for the Americans. Despite advanced technology and good medical supplies, US casualties were high. About 47,244 died in battle and 3,03,704 were wounded. Of those wounded, 23,014 were listed by the Veterans Administration to be 100% disabled. US troops were equipped with heavy weapons and tanks and powerful bombers B-52s. They also used chemical weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, and phosphorus bombs. Many villages were destroyed and jungles decimated. Civilians died in large numbers. In the US, many people were critical of the government for getting involved in a war that they saw as indefensible. The US media and films played a major role in both supporting as well as criticizing the war. US underestimated the power of nationalism to move people to action and fight for independence. They underestimated the power of a small country to fight the most technologically advanced country in the world. Ho Chi Minh Trail symbolizes how the Vietnamese used the limited resources to great advantage. The trail was a network of footpaths and roads used to transport men and materials from the north to the south. Most of the trail was outside Vietnam, in neighboring Laos and Cambodia, with branch lines extending into South Vietnam. The US regularly bombed this trail, trying to disrupt supplies, but efforts to destroy this important supply line by intensive bombing failed because they were rebuilt very quickly. Social movements affect different groups in society. Let us understand the role of women in the nationalism movement of Indochina, Vietnam. Women as rebels. Women in Vietnam enjoyed greater equality than in China, but they had only limited freedom and played no role in public life. As the nationalist movement grew, writers and political thinkers began idealizing women who rebelled against social norms. This rebellion against social conventions marked the arrival of the new woman in Vietnamese society. Heroes of past times. Rebel women of the past were similarly celebrated. Trunk sisters who had fought against Chinese domination in 39 to 43 CE came to be idealized and glorified. They were depicted in paintings, plays, and novels as representing the indomitable will and the intense patriotism of the Vietnamese. Nationalists also popularized and inspired people to action by lords of 3rd century CE Trieu Ao, often who lived with a brother and resisted Chinese rule. Women as warriors. In the 1960s, photographs in magazines and journals showed women as brave fighters and workers. They were shown with a rifle in one hand and a hammer in the other. As casualties in the war increased in the 1960s, women were urged to join the struggle in larger numbers. Many women joined the resistance movement. Between 1965 and 1975, of the 17,000 youth who worked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 70 to 80% were women. Women in times of peace. By the 1970s, as peace talks began and the end of war seemed near, women were no longer represented as warriors. Now, the image of women as workers begins to predominate. They are shown working in agricultural cooperatives, factories, and production units rather than as fighters. The prolongation of the war created strong reactions even within the US. The US had failed to achieve its objectives. They could not crush Vietnamese resistance. Support of the Vietnamese people for US action had not been won. Thousands of young US soldiers lost their lives and countless Vietnamese civilians had been killed. This was the first television war. Battle scenes were shown on the daily news programs. Writers such as Mary McCarthy and actors like Jane Fonda visited North Vietnam and praised the heroic defense of the country. The scholar Noam Chomsky called the war the greatest threat to peace, to national self-determination, and to international cooperation. The widespread questioning of government policy led to end of the war. A peace settlement was signed in Paris in January 1974. This ended conflict with the US, but fighting between the Saigon regime and the NLF continued. The NLF occupied the presidential palace in Saigon on 30th April 1975 and unified Vietnam. (1802) Nguyen An becomes emperor, symbolizing the unification of the country under the Nguyen dynasty. 1867, Cochinchina, the South, becomes a French colony. 1887, creation of the Indo-China Union, including Cochinchina, Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and later Laos. 1930, Ho Chi Minh forms the Vietnamese Communist Party. 1945, Viet Minh start a general popular insurrection. Bao Dai abdicates, Ho Chi Minh declares independence in Hanoi, September 23rd. 1954, the French army is defeated at Dien Bien Phu. 1961, Kennedy decides to increase US military aid to South Vietnam. 1974, Paris Peace Treaty. 1975, April 30th, NLF troops enter Saigon. 1976, the Socialist Republic Vietnam is proclaimed.